Hello, everybody. It's Andrea. I am recording this rather quickly. It's a short one, right before Passover starts. Not having a big celebration. The kids are all gone, family's far away, but a little celebration. But these are some thoughts I wanted to get out of my head before they permanently fled my head. So I'm sharing them with you. This will be a quick one, so without further ado, let me swing into it. I've actually got a slightly different format this time, so there's a little more of me and a little less of the image. I found those itty-bitty things of me a little unnerving. I still find me unnerving. I'm not someone who likes to look at myself, especially because I look like my mother when she was older, and it's just unnerving. It's like seeing my mother returned from the grave. Anyway, if you're looking at the video, what you see is a picture of Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, hiding under his desk. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because we had dinner with friends last night. Lovely people. I've known them forever. And the guy was raised in England, is an American citizen now. He is the American citizen everybody dreams of. Wonderful person, entirely self-sufficient, fanatically conservative and patriotic and fiercely intelligent and an all-around nice person, a very morally decent person. And we asked him what he thought of what was happening in England. And he said, I still have nostalgia for England. I grew up there after all. He came here at the end of his teen years. But he says, I think it's over. And that triggered a line of thinking in me that I wanted to talk about. It's something I've been germinating for a while, so I may as well do the information dump on you right now. And this is my idea that we were talking about the fact of whether the Europeans would rise up. That's where it started, because a lot of people claim that Europeans still have that old fighting spirit. Yeah, they conquered the world. They're fierce. They're ferocious. They were incredibly cruel for centuries. They are not going to take this lying down. Once the lumpen masses delump, that'll be it for this whole Islamic and takeover, mostly Islamic, but also generally third world takeover of these countries. I said no. And I have a very specific reason for thinking this, and it starts with a book I read, and let me change how I'm looking at this so I can get to my images for you. It changes to a book I read called A Troublesome Inheritance by Nicholas Wade. Now, some of you may remember this book. He had written Before the Dawn, which was simply about how you can trace personality traits from genetics. Very interesting theory, because we do have genetics shaping our personality. That's how you have families where they're all more pugnacious and some where they're not. And some of it is nurture, not all of it is nature. But yes, genetics do shape who we are. But what he said, and I'm boiling it down to its essence, which got him fired from the New York Times, is that there are certain races, and I don't remember if he named Africans, but they have more of what we can call aggression genes. They have more genes that are associated with aggressive behavior. And he promptly got fired for this speculation, which they said was utterly baseless, and this and this and this and this. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but a few years later, I read another book, Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature. And people who follow me know that I often cite to this book because it was written in 2011, when he naively thought that the advent of Barack Obama would mean peace forever in the world. But the premise of the book, the subtitle, is Why Violence Has Declined. What he talks about, and he doesn't talk about it in genetic terms, but he talks about it in behavioral terms, which it strikes me can also be talked about in genetic terms. But that's why I started with Nicholas Wade's Troublesome Inheritance. But what he talks about is the fact that basically Europe ceased to be a violent place. And he ascribes it to behavioral changes and really the rise of the state. Because when humans were tribal. Tribalism is incredibly violent. Any Stone Age culture is going to be violent. Every last one of them, they're all violent. This is true throughout history. It's whether you look at the bones of Stone Age cultures tens of thousands of years ago, or you look at how Westerners described Native Americans and other indigenous cultures when they first met them. The nature of tribalism is violent. Tribalism is not a very productive way of living, so it's always subsistence level, and subsistence level means violent fighting and very limited resources for war, and that means a lot of deaths, and it means slavery, because originally concentration camps were simply intended to keep civilian populations out of the way when and you know what, you can see if you're watching the video, I'm having a hard time finding where I am on the damn camera, but it meant getting civilian populations out of the way during the fighting. It was actually meant to be somewhat humane. In practical terms, it never ended up being humane, but it wasn't originally the Nazis' death camps. When my mother was in a Japanese concentration camp, they were not death camps. They just got the civilians all corralled, and then they systematically starved them to death. And the commandant of my mom's camp was actually tried for war crimes because he was one of my mom's camps was insanely cruel. But basically, they got them out of the way, and then as they were losing and their resources ended, they stopped feeding the civilians because they saved it all for the troops. But the point is, that takes resources away from the military. The moment you intern civilians, you have less for your military. And they were also subsistence in that they had no fossil fuel, no clever machinery, even in a pre-fossil fuel age. They had nothing. So what you did was you killed everybody who was a threat to you when you raided the opposite tribe, and then you enslaved anyone else you could. And that was the history of humankind. That is why slavery goes back to the dawn of humankind, because we have always needed to take care of civilians in times of war. You kill them or you enslave them. And of course, you kill all the military men, and you might torture them to death as to make your gods happy. And also as a lesson, don't do this to us again, because you know you're going to be raided. The tit for tat. It was a whole world of Hatfield and McCoy. Then what you get is civil government. And what civil government does is it polices itself. It polices its own community. So civil government, you started getting control over internal law breaking. And in the beginning, it was very brutal. It was, and you still see that in the Islamic world, but it was hands getting chopped off. It was people going to prison. It was usually execution. I mean, every property crime was punishable by death, basically. Murder, punishable by death. So what happened, according to Steven Pinker, is that Europe got rid of its criminal classes. Also, by making crime not something to be proud of, but something that is embarrassing, it made women less inclined to have children with the criminal classes. There was a different trajectory in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world within civil society, it wasn't civil at all, because it was still a very might make right society. And this was true even in the Islamic world, where they were cutting off hands and a huge amount of executions. But the whole purpose of the Islamic world was to train people up to be killers. And in fact, there's still a video circulating of a woman, an Arab woman who I believe came from the West Bank, and her child had a serious brain tumor or something. She brought the child to Israel, where they treated the child at great expense to the Society of Israel. And they interviewed her, a very beautiful young woman wearing her hijab and everything. And she said she was glad that her child could live so it could go and kill Jews. So whatever softening effect of the civil society that the Quran's brutal treatment of criminals might have, the fact that the whole society is built around slaughter of the other offsets that softening, and it makes it a warrior society. Meanwhile, in Europe, you have less and less and less of the warriors of this society, as bad guys are imprisoned and leached out of the culture pool. whether they're out of the gene pool, so they could be out of either the nature or nurture pool or both. I'm not hypothecating which, but we changed. And at the same time, we got the Enlightenment with the norms, and we had Christianity and Judaism, which are about justice and grace and forgiveness. And it was a very different trajectory. But one other thing happened. It wasn't just civil society, civilized Westerners, because we were still very violent. The American Civil War, 600,000 dead in the fight over slavery and states' rights. And then you get to World War I and World War II, but I'm going to focus on World War I because this was an amazing war when you think about it. It was a snowball war with a lot of defensive stuff when the Crown Prince of the Habsburg Empire was executed, and one after the other, all these armies started piling on and taking sides in alliances, which tells you how dangerous alliances can be, especially blind ones that don't look at national self-interest, which is what Trump is trying to do by looking at whether NATO serves any purpose anymore and whether there really are allies in Europe. So what we have is World War I. It's the apex of civilization, or so it seems. Europe hasn't had a major war in a long time. Art, literature, music, they're getting more civilized in terms of child labor and treating the poor. Everything is coming along right, but the savage still lives in the Europeans. So you have things like the Battle of the Somme. I really ought to have started with Ypres, but I always think of the Somme first because it was the bloodiest day in the war. It was not just a battle. It was from July 1st, 1916 to November 18th, 1916. And the combatants were on the one side, the British Empire and France, and on the other side, Germany. There were over 1 million casualties in that time. Now, casualties doesn't mean dead. I looked this up to confirm it. It means people taken off the battlefield. Illness, wounds, death, just going missing, taken prisoner. But in those 5 months, an estimated 300,000 to 350,000 soldiers were killed. July 1st, 1916, the very first day of that battle, was the deadliest day in British military history. 57,000 casualties, which included 19,000 deaths in one single day. And keep in mind, they were fighting over no man's land. They were fighting over minute stretches of land. And then I want to go back to the beginning of the war, and that was the Battle of Ypres. Now, the Battle of Ypres was fought over and over and over. It's a town in Belgium. I was actually there. The entire town was flattened. It was a gorgeous medieval town, but the war completely flattened it. They just went back and forth, gaining a few miles, losing a few miles, gaining a few miles, losing a few miles. Ypres was a disaster for all combatants. It was a terrible thing. It went throughout the entire war from 1914. I've got the notes in front of me, but casualties, October 19 to November 22nd, First Battle of Ypres, 1914, 200,000 to 250,000 casualties, so people taken off the battlefield, 85,000 British, 50,000 French, 130,000 German. It's estimated that of all these people, 100,000 men were killed at the First Battle of Ypres. Then we go to the Second Battle of Ypres, which was in 1915, April 22nd to May 25th. Casualties, 90,000 to 100,000. The Allies on one side, the Germans on the other. This time the Allies got the worst of it with 70,000 dead. And the death toll was around 50,000. And this was the first time that the Germans used poison gas. Next, we have the Third Battle of Ypres, or Passchendaele, which was in 1917, July through November. This time, 500,000 to 600,000 casualties. The British Empire lost, during this, 3-month period, the British Empire lost off the battlefield 275,000 people, German 220,000 men, obviously, and the French by this time were pretty much out of the war. They lost 8,000. The estimated death toll was 250 to 300,000 killed. Now we get to the fourth Battle of Ypres, which was just a few months before the war ended, before November 11. And that was April 7 to April 29, 1918. And the total people lost off the battlefield for any reason, 120,000 to 150,000. Allied, 90,000 gone, and the German 60,000 gone, and the death toll was an estimated 40 to 50,000. So if you look at the four battles around this once beautiful medieval town of Ypres, which has been rebuilt in exactly the same footprint and buildings, but none of it's all from the 1920s and 30s. Total casualties of all battles, men taken off the battlefield. Now, some of them may have gone back to the battlefield. We don't know. Some of them may have been AWOL, whatever. Deserters. Total casualties, 900,000 to 1.1 million. And estimated deaths, 400,000 to 500,000. So those were just two sites of World War I. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of people who were dead. The World War I was a war where, in the beginning, on all sides, eager young men rushed to enlist. Very few made it through to the end of the war. So those were the fighters. Those were the ones who still had the fighting spirit. They were erased. And as the war went on and there was a draft, more and more and more young men were erased. After the war, there was a serious shortage of men. There were a lot of women who never had a partner in their lives because their whole generation was wiped out. Same thing in Germany, same thing in France. And yet, Europe still had that old fighting spirit and went right back into World War II. As you know, about 40 to 60 million people in Europe, about over 400,000 Americans, and the rest were Europeans from the British, all over the British Empire to all over Europe, Western, Central, Eastern Europe, Russia. 40 million people erased. A lot of civilians, and the Holocaust, the Jews, the Gypsies, the homosexuals, whatever the Germans didn't like, the mentally handicapped, physically handicapped. But men are always at the front line of battle. Once again, there were enlistees at the beginning of the war, people who were career military, and then the draft kicked in and more people, men got sucked in. But the first wave to be killed were the people with the fighting spirit. So you look at Europe, and what you have is a continent that civilized itself, and then with its last gasp of incivility, erased millions of its people with aggressive spirit. And then, of course, after the war, it was smugly proud of how passive and weak and disarmed and modern it was. Meanwhile, the Muslim world continued unchanged. It is the same world it was at the time of Muhammad, which is it polices itself fairly strictly, but except for policing very specific crimes, it is an unbelievably brutal world. It's still brutal in how it polices its own crimes, and it is predicated on murderous brutality as to others. The whole purpose of Islam is jihad. There's the House of Dar al-Islam, which is the House of Peace. I think that's what they're called, and Dar al-Jihad, which is the House of War. And Islam is utterly predicated on the House of War, with the anticipation that when they've all killed every Jew, every Christian, every Hindu, every atheist, every Buddhist, everybody, and then they've all killed the other kind of Muslims that they don't like, the big battle of the Sunni and Shia, then the surviving Muslims will magically have peace. Well, then they will embark on the European 2,000-year odyssey towards actual civilization, assuming they're even capable of this. But my point is, when you have a society that has, through nature and nurture and warfare, erased anybody with operative testosterone to defend a society, to defend its women, which, for example, no Western European country defends its women anymore. They leave them to the predations of immigrants. It's not just in England, which had the horrible the Pakistani men, the Rotherham rapes that turned out to be all over the place, the grooming gangs. All of Europe, they take the sides of the immigrant men over over their own women. Look at that young woman in Spain whom this government happily euthanized because of the psychological damage she experienced after being gang raped by illegal immigrants. So you have this completely effete, weakened society, and into it you introduce societies that are tribal and predicated on warfare. So it's not a matter of will the British rise up. I don't think the British can rise up. Will the French rise up? I don't think the French can rise up. I don't think they're capable anymore. They have genetically mutated into people too weak to defend themselves. And they are in an existential battle with people who have never abandoned the very core human Stone Age brain of kill or be killed, of conquer, of torture, of murder. And just to show you what Europe is now, if you're looking, I have a picture of Keir Starmer, who truly is a human, well, sort of a potato, sort of a weasel. This is a man who is so unbelievably weak. He's afraid of Trump. He's afraid of the Muslims. He's afraid of the blacks. He's also afraid of the few British people who still seem to have some cojones and some willingness to fight. He's an utterly useless, cowardly git who's happily presiding over the death of his own country. You also have Emmanuel Macron, who married his mommy, and that tells you, well, not literally, not incestuous, but a woman almost old enough to be his mommy, or maybe actually old enough to be his mommy, which tells you everything you need to know about the man, and who told Israel, you're not getting any of our weapons, and then when Israel thumbed its nose at him, is frantically backtracking and talking about bringing the embassy to Jerusalem. And I mean, these people are weasel people. They are utterly weak. They believe in nothing. And I don't think they have any genetic material, nature, nurture, whatever, that is capable of withstanding the people they invited into their borders and asked, really begged to destroy them. And I think that's unutterably tragic because Europe, as I always say, I grew up in a very, very pro-European home. My parents never quite got over being Europeans. European food was better. European architecture was better. European art, European culture, European music. That's how I grew up. And I have learned to love America with an overwhelming passion because we are still a vital, living, dynamic country with a wonderful culture, and it's my country and I'm proud of it. But I also loved European art and food and architecture and the mellow countryside, and I will be very sad to see it fall if it happens in my lifetime. I don't think we can avoid that. And on that cheery note, it's time for me to go and do my Seder. So you guys will be seeing this on April 2nd. And thank you for giving me your time and listening. I always appreciate it.